bank is robbed. There are no witnesses. Its president is missing without a trace. When a body surfaced, the criminal investigation grew deadly serious. Federal agents descended upon a small town that found itself gripped by fear.
When the small community of Noel, Missouri discovered their bank was robbed, they were shocked. When the bank president turned up missing, they were outraged. But things aren't always as they first appear. And when clues began to surface, the facts were more terrible than anyone could have guessed. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. For federal agents, the Noel bank robbery became an intricate case in modern forensics and dogged determination.
The Cowskin Bridge over Grand Lake, Oklahoma, just after 3 a.m. The lake is popular for fishing and boating. But on this night, it would be the scene of something far more sinister. A gruesome crime, meticulously planned and executed. A cold-blooded murder that would shatter the tranquility of the nearby town of Noel, Missouri.
No! No! No!
Tucked away in the southwest corner of Missouri and home to about 1,200 residents, Noel is a community proud of its small-town charms and low crime rate. On the morning of October 6, 1989, Pauline Coonrod headed off to work at the State Bank of Noel. The cashier's first task upon arriving was to unlock the front doors. But Coonrod found the doors already open. She thought perhaps the bank president, Dan Short, had arrived early. But as she walked through the building, she saw no one. Within moments, Coonrod realized the vault had been robbed. Noel police and the McDonald County, Missouri sheriff responded to Coonrod's 911 call. The FBI was also called in since the bank was insured by the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. An agent was sent to investigate from the nearby Joplin, Missouri office. The entire scene was meticulously photographed and dusted for prints. The agent noticed that the security camera had been spray painted and shot out. Spent casings found below the camera indicated that the robbers used a .45 caliber handgun. Investigators discovered that the thieves had made off with over $71,000, including 320 pounds of quarters, dimes, and nickels. Strangely, more than $100,000 in bills was left behind in an unlocked drawer. Bank President Dan Short was one of 4 bank employees with access to the vault and its time lock. Yet he was the only one of the 4 who hadn't arrived that morning. Questioning him became essential to the investigation. Bank Vice President Mark Allman told investigators that Short intended to work late the night before.
The time lock on the vault hadn't been set the night that the robbery occurred. Dan had came in was in the habit of working later in the evenings, different times during the week, but that particular night he'd put it on standby so that he could come back at a later time and open the vault manually.
Agents wondered if Dan Short had in fact returned to the bank that evening. The sheriff drove to Short's house in Arkansas, near the Missouri border. But no one was home, and his red pickup truck was gone. Short's absence alarmed investigators. They couldn't help but wonder what role the banker played in the robbery. Within hours, word of the crime spread throughout the scandalized community.
Noel's a small town. Main industries, poultry processing plants, some small shops, local merchants, quiet town, tourism in the summertime with the rivers, that sort of thing. But basically just your average small town.
Crimes like this did not happen here. Reports of the heist and the missing bank president filled Noel news broadcasts. Investigators received many calls from the community offering help. One call from an employee at Sibley Manufacturing just outside of town gave investigators their first break.
Hey, listen, come in this morning. I see this truck.
He reported a red pickup truck abandoned in the factory parking lot. The truck was registered to Dan Short. Investigators found coin wrappers strewn across the truck bed. The truck was dusted for fingerprints, but only Short's were identified.
That's a whole roll of dimes.
The discovery of the truck gave case agent and 19-year FBI veteran Liddell Farley a couple of scenarios to pursue.
At the end of the first day, we weren't sure if we were dealing with an abducted banker or whether the banker, Mr. Short, had absconded with the money. Stops were being placed with his credit card. Airports were being canvassed. Rental car agencies were being checked to see if he perhaps had leased a car. But primarily we're looking for his body, either alive or dead, in the immediate area of Noel.
With Short still missing, investigators secured a search warrant for the bank president's house, hoping to find something that would lead to his whereabouts.
Stay police. Anybody home? Mr. Short.
Inside, all was quiet.
Trooper, look here a minute.
In the kitchen, they discovered an overturned trash can, suggesting perhaps a struggle. They searched every room.
Hi, come here a minute.
By the bed, they found Short's glasses on the nightstand. He never went anywhere without them.
Let's get some light on in here. See, I think that's just
It appeared that the banker had left in a hurry.
I'd say he cleared. Yeah.
Still, it was impossible to determine from the search whether he had fled or was abducted. With no sign of Short, agents canvassed his neighborhood, hoping for a lead. One neighbor, Carol Dryden, recalled seeing several vehicles pulling into Short's driveway the night of the robbery. Assistant U.S. Attorney Mike Jones was involved early in the investigation. According to Jones, Dryden's statement was critical.
Around 2 o'clock in the morning, which really gave us the first time frame, she saw lights going into Dan Short's property, headlights, and then about 15 or 20 minutes later going out of Dan Short's driveway.
But the neighbor's statement didn't put the FBI any closer to finding Short. McDonald County Sheriff Don Schlesman was a lead investigator in the case and coordinated the massive search for the banker in the area surrounding Noel.
We set up a command post on the west side of Noel. The groups were split up, giving roads to walk down. Highway Patrol had their helicopter down, we had airplanes. Just mainly did a search from the air and ground.
Beginning from the location where Short's truck was found, search teams proceeded outwards in concentric circles, hoping to find a trace of Short in the immediate vicinity. 5 days after the crime, there was still no trace of the bank president. As the hunt expanded, Farley and 22 agents from the Kansas City office formed a task force with local law enforcement. To house the large number of personnel, the FBI set up headquarters at the local armory. While they unpacked, leads came pouring in from concerned residents. One tip came from local truck driver Buddy Mills. Having heard about the heist, Mills told an agent about what he saw on a road in Noel the morning of the robbery.
This was 3 a.m. in the morning.
Returning home from work at about 3 a.m., he encountered 3 vehicles leaving town. One truck matched the description of Short's red pickup. It headed off with a 2-tone van. The other dark-colored truck followed Mills for a while until it turned down a road toward neighboring Arkansas. This information jibed with Carol Dryden's recollection of the traffic outside of Short's house at 2 a.m. Mills' account reinforced the time frame for the crime. Farley met with the bank president's ex-wife, Joyce, who had been married to Short for 25 years. Although they had recently separated, Joyce stressed he was a loving father to their 2 children. Having worked closely with him at the bank for several years, she never witnessed any impropriety. Yet Short was the FBI's only suspect right now, and after several days of searching, he was still missing. On October 11th, a couple fishing in Grand Lake, just over the state line in Oklahoma, hunted for a good spot to drop a line. They motored to a favorite shady spot. Hoping to hook some bass, they sighted what looked like a clump of seaweed floating on the water. Moving closer, they made a gruesome discovery. Just under the surface, they saw the head and arms of a submerged body. 5 days after the robbery of the State Bank of Noel, Missouri, a dead body surfaced. 2 employees of the marina towed it to a dock. The body was badly decomposed, but the coroner determined that the man had been dead for 5 days. Immediately after death, bacteria begin to break down the soft tissues of the organs, releasing gaseous compounds. After a few days, the gas fills the corpse and can lift the submerged body to the surface. Sheriff Don Schlesman recalled the bloated remains lifted additional weight from the bottom of the lake.
He had the chain tied to him in a concrete block and part of a chair. And it was a pretty gruesome sight, really.
A corpse will float until the skin tears, releasing the gases. Then the body will sink back to the bottom. If the boaters hadn't seen the body that day, it may have never been found. The time of death was later determined to be consistent with the time frame of Dan Short's disappearance. The sheriff found a wallet in the victim's back pocket. Inside was a driver's license confirming the identity as Dan Short. The sheriff contacted the FBI. The search for 51-year-old Dan Short was over, and a homicide investigation had begun.
With his surfacing, which was almost in defiance of the people who had murdered him, it gave us the knowledge of what had happened, and it gave us the focus that we needed in the investigation to direct resources thereafter.
Farley and his partner Larry Nolan rushed to the lake to conduct their own review of the body. Special Agent Nolan's first task was to preserve the evidence.
Collectively, the decision was made to release Mr. Short from the chair, at which time I released him and preserved the concrete block and the chain hoist, the chair, and also the duct tape.
Okay, guys, that's undone.
With Short's corpse freed from his death trap, the coroner removed the body. The medical examiner determined the probable cause of death was drowning. The chair with the block, chain hoist, and duct tape were examined and photographed by investigators before being sent to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. The task force set up a hotline and published pictures of the chair to alert the public, hoping someone would come forward with information.
It was clear from examining the chair and the apparatus, so to speak, that was attached to it, and the location of Mr. Short's body, that he had died a horrible death. All indications are that he was conscious when he was dropped from the bridge, some 30 feet to the water.
The hotline was inundated with calls, helping build a file of more than 80 suspects. According to Sheriff Don Schlesman, one promising tip came from an anonymous caller who urged investigators to question two brothers, Joe and Shannon Agofsky.
The Joplin Police Department dispatch received an anonymous call from someone that said the Agofskys had a lot of change in their possession, and a lot of change was what was taken from the bank.
The FBI tracked down 23-year-old Joe Agofsky at a junkyard just south of Noel. The manager pointed agents to where Joe worked on his car.
Yeah, sure. He's working right out there in that yard right there.
Oh, that's him right there in the black vest?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. How you doing? You Joe Agofsky?
Yes, sir.
Joe said that on the night of the robbery, he had been at his girlfriend's house, more than 40 miles from
Is she
Noel.
available, and does she live locally here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, very good.
We're also interested in 45 handguns. Do you have that?
He was cooperative and told them he had two .45 caliber handguns,
Could we see it?
the same caliber as the weapon used to shoot out the security camera. They inquired if they could test fire the guns. Joe agreed and told investigators the weapons were stored at his home. His 18-year-old brother Shannon would be there to meet them.
And your brothers? Is this?
When the agents arrived, Shannon Agofsky showed them where the guns were kept. Shannon told investigators that on the night of the murder, he was at his mother's house, where he was still living at the time of the crime.
All right. It's going to be all right if we take these downtown?
After firing both guns, agents sent the shell casings to the FBI lab. Examiners there would later determine that they did not match those found at the bank. To lead agent Farley, it was a dead end.
Both expressed their willingness to help the investigation if they could. Both had alibis for the evening of the crime. Given these factors, our attention was directed elsewhere with other suspects, as both the Agofsky brothers appeared to be not involved in this crime.
Back at Grand Lake in Oklahoma, where Short's body had been recovered 2 days earlier, resident Rowdy Foreman was out fishing with his son and daughter when he made a curious discovery along the shore.
We came across a wooden dowel, a brace, if you want to call it that, and it was just out of place.
Alongside the chair part, Foreman also found a piece of duct tape. Having seen pictures in the newspaper, he believed it may have been from the chair found with Short's body. He sent his son to fetch plastic bags from his house in order to preserve his find. Sheriff Don Schlesman and a partner drove to Oklahoma to question Foreman about the discovery.
And they asked me, said, do you have a piece of evidence? I told them, I said, I don't know if it's evidence. I said, I found a piece of duct tape. And his first comment was, oh my God, isn't that pretty? And they were looking at the fingerprint, just clear as day. There was a print there.
The fingerprint appeared to be made from car grease, impervious to the lake water. But investigators still had to prove the tape was used in the crime.
Although the tape contained fingerprints, that piece of evidence was not relevant unless it could be proven to be part of the chair or the apparatus in which Mr. Short was drowned.
To prove that, FBI examiners would have to match the glue and strands from the torn piece of tape with the tape found on the chair. But that would take weeks. Until then, the FBI and local investigators still had no prime suspects for the crime. A week after the robbery of the State Bank of Noel, Missouri, and the brutal murder of its president, Dan Short, the FBI had recovered Short's body, the murder device, and a possible fingerprint from a nearby lake. Investigators fielded calls from residents who were willing to help, but also afraid to do so.
Due to the manner in which Mr. Short was killed, although the local citizens were very concerned and wanted to be helpful, some were reluctant to do so out of fear. Therefore, some of the witnesses did not come forth. They did so sometimes out of the insistence of a friend or an associate.
Farley received one such call from a man who claimed his friend might have information about the chain hoist wrapped around the chair that drowned Dan Short. The friend's name was Wayne Boutain. Boutain owned the chain hoist, which had recently been stolen. Though he notified the police, the hoist was never recovered. He suspected the Agofskis of stealing it. Farley showed Boutain the photos of the hoist investigators had retrieved from the lake. Boutain identified it as his own. He recognized damage on the pulley. He'd last seen the apparatus at Sheila Agofski's house where he had once lived. Boutain agreed to take a polygraph test and passed it.
Another important development in the case was the determination that the chain hoist, which was duct taped to the chair, was property of Wayne Boutain, who had left it at the residence of Sheila Agofski a few days before the murder of Mr. Short.
On the strength of Boutain's statement, Farley decided to question the Agofskis again. Driving up to their mother's house, he noticed an old van in the front yard. It closely matched the description of one of the vehicles Buddy Mills saw the night of the bank heist.
Can I help you with anything?
Yes, ma'am.
Farley questioned Sheila about the missing chain hoist, but she claimed to have no memory of it. She also corroborated Shannon's alibi, saying he was at her house the night of the murder.
I don't know anything about it. I have no idea.
Okay.
I can't help you with anything.
I appreciate your time. We'll be back in touch.
Farley left with suspicions that she knew more than she was telling. He asked the brothers to give their fingerprints, hoping to match the one found on the duct tape. Joe Agofski complied. When asked about the hoist, he told Farley he remembered seeing it at his mother's house, yet he didn't know what became of it. A few days later, Farley returned to Sheila Agofsky's.
I'm Special Agent Farley.
There he found Shannon with a friend by the name of Gant Sanders. Having secured Joe's fingerprints, Farley tried to convince Shannon to give his as well.
Set of his fingerprints. It'd make things a lot easier. Possibly get you out of some trouble.
Joe Agofsky was very cooperative and produced his fingerprints upon request without hesitation, while Shannon was evasive and hesitant to.
Gant Sanders watched cautiously. Shannon echoed his mother's story, proclaiming he had no knowledge of the chain hoist.
I'll be seeing you guys later.
He eventually promised Farley he'd come down to the police station to give his prints, but he never showed. Although Farley had initially dismissed the Agofskys as suspects, he took note that Shannon and Joe's memories of the chain hoist were conflicting. Now, he decided to take a closer look into their background. Researching the family's financial records, Farley discovered that 9 years earlier they had received money from an insurance settlement after their father died in a plane crash. Popular opinion was that their money was still plentiful, making them unlikely candidates for bank robbers. But Farley learned that wasn't so.
While they had all received a considerable sum of money, as of that time, Joe had spent his. Their mother had spent a large portion of hers, and Shannon Agofsky had a considerable amount of money still in a fund, but it was not available to him at that time until he was 21.
Agents found that both brothers had recently purchased cars with cash, yet neither had jobs. Investigators also determined that 18-year-old Shannon had spent more than $5,000 since the heist. Although the Agofsky brothers' spending looked suspicious, Farley still had no solid evidence linking them to the bank robbery and murder. Revisiting crime reports and witness statements, he made a new connection. Truck driver Buddy Mills said he had seen 3 vehicles leaving Noel on the night of the robbery. That meant there was a possible third suspect out there. If 2 of the vehicles were driven by the Agofsky brothers, then perhaps the other was driven by one of their friends. Farley recalled the young man he met briefly on the Agofsky's porch the day he questioned Shannon, Gant Sanders. Sanders had recently become Shannon's roommate. Farley tracked him down at a junkyard.
The closest associate that we could identify of both Shannon and Joe Agofsky was Gant Sanders. It was learned that Gant had been good friends with both Joe and Shannon, both prior to and after the robbery and murder.
But Sanders said he knew nothing about the robbery and murder, although he offered no alibi for the night in question. Farley decided to question Shannon again, this time with a polygraph machine.
A couple of things about the test is nothing will be painful.
The test was administered in a motel room by a technician from the Missouri capital of Springfield. A polygraph is used by investigators as a tool to rule out possible suspects. The machine monitors the subject's reactions to stress in 3 ways. Tubes fastened around the chest monitor the slightest change in respiration. Low-voltage electrodes placed on the finger detect moisture on the skin.
All right, relax your arms.
And a cuff on the arm measures changes in blood pressure. The examination is based on the body's fight or flight principle.
I'll need you to sit perfectly still.
When the brain perceives a physical or psychological threat, the body responds by increasing blood pressure, heart rate, and respiration. Shannon Agofsky was asked about Dan Short, the robbery, and the murder.
Did you take a chain hoist from Wayne Butane's?
No.
Did you kill Dan Short?
No.
Based on his physiological responses, the examiner determined that the younger Rogowski brother was deceptive about his knowledge of the crime. It was clear to Farley that Shannon was somehow involved.
You do.
But he'd need more convincing evidence to bring charges.
Figure out what's best for yourself.
In December 1989, the Rogowskis were subpoenaed to appear before a grand jury to answer questions under oath. Each family member gave testimony separately. Shannon, Joe, and Sheila each disavowed any knowledge of the bank robbery and the murder of Dan Short. After questioning, Shannon was once again asked to supply his fingerprints voluntarily.
Can you tell me where these are?
Again, he agreed and set an appointment. In Washington, D.C., FBI analysts continued to examine the items sent to them by the agents in Noel, trying to match the chair part and tape retrieved by Foreman to the chair and tape that had been bound to Dan Short. An examiner confirmed that the wood found by Rowdy Foreman was part of the same chair that Dan Short was taped to. The piece of tape with the fingerprint on it was the most promising piece of evidence. But did it match the tape used on the chair and body? It did. Examiners were conclusively able to link these portions of tape by matching the torn ends, the fibers, and the glue. The tape found by Foreman had 2 complete prints on it. They compared the prints to Joe Rogowski's, but they did not match. Farley recalled this finding was not all bad news.
The fingerprint examiner notified me that the prints on the tape were similar to that of Joe Rogowski, but not identical. And he advised me that the fingerprints of siblings were often similar in pattern. Therefore, getting the fingerprints of Shannon Rogowski was imperative.
Although he told the grand jury he would provide his fingerprints, Shannon never did. But this time, Farley would force Shannon to comply by serving him with a subpoena. Grudgingly, Shannon Rogowski gave his prints to the FBI almost 5 months after the heist and murder. Since comparing his prints to those found on the tape would take several weeks, Shannon was free to go. But Agent Farley did not remain idle. He knew that Gant Sanders was close to both brothers and probably knew more about the crime than he had said. So he decided to confront him. He told Sanders that if he was innocent and had knowledge of the crime, he should cooperate with the investigation. But if Sanders was knowingly protecting the Rogowskis and they were convicted of the robbery and murder, Sanders would be jailed for aiding and abetting. Worse, without a solid alibi, he was still under suspicion of the crime. But Sanders revealed nothing. He remained faithful to the brothers. Farley thought that perhaps Sanders was hiding his guilt with his silence. Agent Farley pursued 2 brothers, Joe and Shannon Rogowski, as the prime suspects in the bank heist and murder. Joe's fingerprints had been compared to the 2 found on the duct tape from the murder device. His did not match. As investigators waited for results on a comparison with Shannon's, additional partial prints were discovered on the tape. Now the FBI needed new prints from Shannon, a 360-degree view to match the partial prints on the duct tape. But Shannon was nowhere to be found. Farley hoped that he could get to Shannon through one of the Rogowski brothers' friends, Gant Sanders. The agent also suspected Sanders could be the unidentified accomplice. But cooperating with the FBI would mean betraying his longtime friends. Finally, in June of 1990, hoping to clear his name, he contacted Farley, wanting to talk. Investigators told Sanders they thought that he had helped commit the bank robbery and murder in Noel with the Agofsky brothers. But Sanders claimed he had nothing to do with the crime. However, he did admit to his involvement in another, more recent incident. On one particular evening in late December 1989, Shannon and Joe Agofsky broke into a house in Missouri and stole several rifles. The brothers rendezvoused with Sanders later that evening, setting the second part of their plan into action. The next day, Sanders and Shannon drove across the state line into Arkansas and sold the guns. It was a federal violation. Sanders recalled another time when the brothers tried to convince him to participate in another, more violent crime just months after Dan Short's murder. Sheriff Don Schlesman recalled how the Agofskys tried to recruit Sanders.
And they told him, we're not doing any more Mickey Mouse stuff. We're going to go hit a place, and there's probably going to be some shooting, because they got armed guards. And if you don't really want to kill somebody, you'd probably better let us know so we can take you back home. And so Gant told him he didn't really think he wanted to be involved in something like that, so they turned around and did take him home.
By cooperating with the FBI, Sanders made a deal for his role in the illegal sale of the firearms and was put on probation. He was also finally dismissed as a third suspect in the bank robbery, passing a lie detector test 3 times. With the help of Sanders' statement, Farley issued a federal warrant for Shannon Agofsky. He was indicted for transporting and selling firearms across state lines. Since Joe had not been involved in the sale, he was not charged. Authorities tracked down Shannon in a small town in Arkansas several months later. When apprehended, police searched his vehicle and found several bags of nickels in his trunk. Shannon was turned over to authorities in Missouri and booked in the Springfield Federal Courthouse.
Look at me.
While being processed, Farley acquired the set of Shannon's fingerprints examiners had been waiting for. The FBI lab needed a front and back view of his prints, hoping to match 2 partial prints found on the duct tape used in the murder of Dan Short. But his older brother Joe was still free, and Farley had little evidence to tie him to the crimes. Investigators knew the brothers remained in contact while Shannon was behind bars. Since all prison conversations were recorded, agents got a glimpse into the Agofskys' family relationship. Shannon made a number of calls to his mother and Joe. According to Assistant U.S. Attorney Mike Jones, one call was particularly incriminating.
Shannon was asking Joe if we would be able to make a case against him, and Joe indicated that we would not be able to put him at the scene.
Farley knew the brothers were worried, but the call was not enough to arrest Joe. Then, just days later, he finally received the results from the lab.
Those fingerprints turned out to be the fingerprints of Shannon Agofsky. The tape was determined to have come from the chair in which Mr. Short was bound to. Therefore, that piece of tape became a most important piece of evidence in this case.
Mike Jones now had a strong case against Shannon.
We knew we were going to prosecute Shannon once we got those first 2 fingerprints, and then the main focus was on Joe, trying to get a case built against Joe.
How's it going?
Finding evidence against Joe was a thorny task. Nothing directly linked him to the crime. Once again, Farley combed through financial records to see how much Joe had spent.
We attempted to determine all his cash transactions and did determine that he had spent some $19,000 in cash during the 16 months following the robbery. During that time, he was unemployed and had no logical explanation for having that much cash.
Scrutinizing Joe's phone records, Farley made another important find. Joe had made several long-distance calls to his girlfriend at her home during the very days leading up to and after the robbery.
Yeah.
The calls destroyed his alibi. Joe had stated that he was staying with her the entire time.
Not too smart.
They called Sanders in for additional questioning, hoping he could shed more light on Joe's involvement. Sanders told the agents about a conversation he had with both Agofsky brothers. That incident took place in Sammy Skaggs' junkyard.
The three of them were working on one of the cars, and Sammy Skaggs announced that the banker from Joplin was here to pick up his car. And that apparently generated a comment from, I believe it was Joe, that what the three of them ought to do was to follow a banker, follow him home, grab him, kidnap him, and force him to take him to the bank and open the vault.
At the time, Sanders agreed that it might be an easy way to get rich. The plan sounded eerily like what could have happened to Dan Short. It was now clear to the FBI that the brothers had the knowledge, motive, and opportunity to pull off the homicide and heist. Based on accumulating evidence, Joe Agofsky was arrested more than 2 years after the horrifying crime. Both brothers were indicted on 3 federal counts relating to the bank robbery and murder. But would the evidence be strong enough to convict the 2 brothers? The investigators were betting on it. Almost 3 years after a bank heist and brutal murder, FBI agent Liddell Farley handed prosecutors all the evidence the task force had amassed. Reviewing their files, the agents described the Agofskys' plans and actions to Assistant U.S. Attorney Mike Jones and his associates. They were determined to prove beyond any doubt that the brothers had committed the crime. The FBI had learned that Joe Agofsky, needing information about the state bank's floor plan, had opened a safe deposit box a few weeks before the crime. Bank Vice President Mark Ullman told investigators that Joe was particularly interested in Dan Short as well. He made a point of asking who Short was and where he lived.
He's our president. Would you like to meet him?
Oh, no, thanks. I was just asking who he was.
Returning home, Joe drew floor plans to the bank and plotted the crime with Shannon. They decided to do the job before the sun rose, so there would be no witnesses.
We're going to go through the front door. When we get through there, I want you guys to knock the cameras out.
To get into the vault, they needed someone who had the keys and knew the combination.
Make sure you get them keys.
For that, they would abduct Dan Short, the bank president, and force him to open the vault. Afterwards, they needed to make sure he'd never talk.
Don't give that combination up.
They thought it would be easy money. Life would be good with their new fortunes.
Let's get these guns clean. Let's get...
In the early hours of October 6th, Joe and Shannon Agofsky put their plan into motion. Acting as a lookout for them was an unidentified accomplice who drove the blue Chevy pickup. It was the same vehicle neighbor Carol Dryden recalled seeing around Short's house a week before the kidnapping. The brothers loaded their mother's brown and tan van with the equipment they would need to commit the crime. At around 2 a.m., they arrived at Dan Short's house, a brief trip across the Arkansas border. Eventually, he awoke from a deep sleep. The intruders would be the last people he ever saw.
Get out of here.
Short tried to flee, but he had no chance against the brothers and their accomplice. They threatened to kill him unless he turned over his keys to the bank.
Leave me alone. I haven't done shut up.
Silencing him, the intruders dragged Short outside. The terror continued as Short was stuffed into the front seat of the van. Each criminal drove one of the vehicles, including Short's red pickup, as they sped off for the bank. Agent Farley and the prosecutors continued piecing together the events of October 6th. The Agofskis and their accomplice pulled up to the bank, only a brief drive from Short's house. With their captive in tow, the robbers quickly opened the bank's front door and ran in. No alarm sounded because Short had neglected to set them, and no one would ever be able to see what was about to happen.
Let's go to that desk.
After ripping the duct tape off his mouth, they pulled Short over to his desk and retrieved the keys to the safe. Then they forced him to provide the vault's combination.
Hurry up, right.
Once inside, they grabbed all that was in reach.
Get him out, get out.
And dashed away.
Go, I'll blow your head off. Move it.
They dumped the loot in the truck. Afraid for his life, Short complied with their every demand. But the assailants pistol whipped him and knocked him out. On the way out of Noel, Buddy Mills crossed paths with the brothers. After he passed the intersection, the three vehicles sped off, the first two heading toward Grand Lake. Reaching Grand Lake, some 22 miles from Noel, the two remaining vehicles stopped along the high point of the Cowskin Bridge. Here, Shannon and the unknown accomplice prepared to kill Short by drowning him. In his haste, Shannon took off his gloves to secure a portion of the tape.
Shut up!
And unknowingly left greasy fingerprints behind.
Stop! What are you doing? Stop! Don't do this.
Then the two attached the stolen chain hoist.
I'll do anything. Anything you want.
When they finished, they lifted Short above the lake.
Oh, no! No!
And plunged him into the black water below. At the first trial in September 1992, the evidence was strong enough to persuade a jury to convict Shannon and Joe Agofsky of 3 federal crimes relating to the robbery, abduction, and use of firearms during the illegal acts. In the state trial, only Shannon was found guilty of murder. Though the unidentified accomplice was never found, it was determined that the Agofsky brothers were the masterminds and principal perpetrators of the crime. No charges were brought against their mother, Sheila.
Without doubt, this was the most difficult investigation I've been involved in as an FBI agent. Some 29 years of investigating various crimes. This was an unusually heinous crime.
Today, Joe and Shannon Agofsky are serving life sentences with no chance of parole. For his cooperation, Gant Sanders served the remainder of his firearms charge on probation. Noel has returned to normal, a violent chapter in its history now closed. Yet because of the crimes of these blood brothers, it will never be the same quiet, innocent place it once was. A pair of serial killers roamed the Midwest, preying on adults and children alike. Always a step behind, agents had no choice but to follow the trail of bodies. as the crime spree raged out of control. Pressure mounted to stop these killers.
They swept through 6 states like a plague, thrill killers acting without rhyme or reason. They targeted adults and young girls, kidnapping, murdering, then moving on to kill again. And in their rampage, they left plenty of clues. But moving targets are the hardest to hit. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. The hunt was on for these killers with a knack for eluding authorities. We hoped a nationwide dragnet would bring them to justice.
In Kenosha, Wisconsin, a community close to the Illinois border, single mother Juanita Wheat arrived home with her 9-year-old daughter Vernita and their new friend Robert Knight. It was getting late on the evening of May 29, 1984, when they returned from a day of fun at a local carnival. Robert told Juanita that he had a belated Mother's Day present for her at his place just a few blocks away. He asked if Vernita could help him carry it back. He promised it would only take an hour. Reluctant at first, Juanita gave in to her daughter's excited pleas.
All right. Be goodbye, baby. I'll be right back. Take care, mommy. I will.
As it approached midnight, Robert and Vernita had not yet returned. Juanita was anxious about leaving her apartment to look for her daughter. If Vernita arrived to an empty home, the young girl might panic. But the worry became too great. Juanita decided to go and find her daughter. She went to the address Robert had given her. When she arrived, her panic melted into horror. The building that Robert Knight claimed was his home was abandoned. Not knowing where else to turn, Juanita went to her friend Ellen Reeves for help. Concerned for the safety of her friend's daughter, Ellen insisted it was time to contact the police. Juanita told the officer that her happy, outgoing daughter would not have run away. The officer's focus turned to Robert Knight. Juanita said she had met Robert a month earlier. He introduced himself while riding through the neighborhood on his bike. They had become friendly, and Robert had become fond of young Vernita. The police didn't have a Robert Knight on record. The officer asked Juanita to check mugshots for anyone who might look like him. Juanita scanned 2 books of photos. Finally, she pointed to a picture of a man she was sure was Robert Knight. Officers determined that the person Juanita had identified as Robert Knight was really named Alton Coleman. Investigators called the FBI. Special Agent Verdina Passanelli of the FBI's Kenosha, Wisconsin office was assigned the investigation.
But the FBI always gets involved when children of tender years disappear under unusual circumstances, and this was clearly one of those.
Investigators wasted no time in obtaining a search warrant for Coleman's last known address, his grandmother's house in Waukegan, Illinois, just a few miles across the state line from where the Wheats lived. A young woman answered the door. When questioned by the detective, she identified herself as Deborah Brown, Coleman's girlfriend. At first, Brown was reluctant to answer any questions about Coleman or his whereabouts. She said she had been living at the residence for a year, providing home care for Coleman's nearly blind grandmother. The investigators persisted. They finally convinced Deborah to cooperate.
Do you know his whereabouts right now?
She told them that Coleman had been gone all night, but came home alone at about 8 o'clock in the morning. He had come by to change into a suit for a court appearance later that morning. Coleman had been charged with raping a 14-year-old girl at knife point. Brown also admitted that Coleman had told her he had done something really bad the night before, but he did not explain what. Investigators waited at the house for Coleman's return while other officers canvassed the area.
Okay, do you know if did he drive?
He was nowhere to be found. The FBI joined forces with local investigators. Detectives from Kenosha and nearby Waukegan, Illinois, already knew Coleman's reputation. He was a violent criminal with a disturbing past.
As I learned about Coleman, I realized he was extremely dangerous because the Waukegan Police Department had an extensive arrest record on him. He had been arrested almost 10 years previously for the rape of a 40-year-old woman, and he had a number of other arrests, mostly for assault, for molestation, rape of a child. And as you looked at these cases and you listened to the detectives who were familiar with him, you saw a picture of an increasingly violent person.
The task force enlisted every available officer and agent to help in the search for Coleman and Vernita.
Well, our strategy that night was to find Alton Coleman. We sat down then at the police department and assembled everything we knew. We came up with information that he a lot of times rode the train, he took taxis because he didn't have a car. What happened then is we split up into teams and went out and started interviewing people.
On the streets, investigators talked with drivers at various taxi stands. Everyone was familiar with Alton Coleman. The cabbies agreed that if they saw him, they would notify the police. The task force offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to Coleman's arrest. The promise of a reward caught people's attention, but didn't draw out any useful leads as quickly as the investigators hoped. Investigators feared that time may be running out for Vernita Wheat. On May 31st, 2 days into the investigation, a cab driver in Waukegan who knew Coleman from the neighborhood called in to report he was picking Coleman up. A squad car conducting surveillance in the area responded. Coleman was dropped off at his sister Terry's place. He saw the approaching officer and took off. He disappeared into the neighborhood he knew so well. The investigation was only 2 days old, and their suspect was within their grasp. Investigators speculated Coleman was probably hiding out in the abandoned warehouses that ran along Lake Michigan. Hoping that Coleman might respond to his sister's voice, the detective summoned her.
Waukegan Police, ma'am, please open up. I'm Detective Hanson from Luther, Anton.
Though she was Coleman's own flesh and blood, she was also a mother of a young girl. The agents convinced her to help. Talking to her brother through a bullhorn, she pleaded with him to turn himself in.
Alton, you need to come on out and give yourself up.
Meanwhile, officers and agents fanned out and searched the area. But even in such a confined space, finding Coleman would not be easy. Lieutenant Mark Hansen of the Waukegan Police Department was the lead investigator for the task force.
This area has a lot of abandoned buildings, a lot of abandoned apartment complexes. It's heavily brushed. It was at nighttime, easy to escape in there and not be seen again. This was 1984. We didn't have helicopters with searchlights. We didn't have infrared. We didn't have the resources to fully encircle an area of that size.
The search continued through the night. But after 8 hours, it seemed their suspect and their best chance of finding 9-year-old Vernita had slipped through their fingers. Desperate to generate leads, investigators saturated the local media with details surrounding the abduction. TV and newspapers ran photographs of Vernita Wheat, asking anyone with any information to contact the task force. The news spread quickly. Investigators were flooded with sightings of Coleman from the public. Most were dead ends. But one cab driver who saw Vernita's picture on the news contacted the task force. He remembered picking up Coleman and the little girl on the night of her disappearance. He had assumed they were father and daughter. The cab driver dropped them off around midnight near a scrapyard in the industrial section of Waukegan.
That one particular night, where did you take him to?
Investigators approached the night manager at the scrapyard.
Evening. Hi. Sir, I'm Detective Hanson, Waukegan Police. Here's my card. This is Agent Showers.
He told them that he had in fact seen a man with a young girl on the night in question. He recalled that close to midnight, the two had walked hand in hand through the side gate. He couldn't really see the man's face, but he did notice that the man had an unusual rolling gait to his walk, a feature that acquaintances of Coleman had described. The night manager identified the little girl as Vernita Wheat. The sighting was enough to allow the FBI to issue a federal warrant for Alton Coleman. He had taken Vernita across state lines. It was also the last time anyone saw Vernita Wheat alive. The task force responded with another massive search.
We had about 150 FBI agents and detectives from both Kenosha and Waukegan. We did a methodical search where Coleman was last seen with Vernita. This included using dogs going through the junkyard, house-to-house and abandoned building searches, all in this downtown area, and we found nothing.
Investigators knew she was alive at midnight on the evening she disappeared. They also knew that Coleman was alone the next morning at 8 a.m. as he prepared for his court appearance.
So total there's
The question was, what happened to Vernita during that 8-hour gap?
profile from FBI headquarters in Coleman.
FBI Special Agent Jeff Showers was on the task force. He struggled to fit the pieces together.
How far is he going to travel with this girl? The girl may not even be in Waukegan. She may be in another town. But we knew that the longer that we waited, it was getting dimmer and dimmer.
Coleman and Vernita seemed to have vanished. On the night of June 19th, 3 weeks after Vernita's disappearance, investigators received a call from a man in Waukegan who was looking through an abandoned building for scrap metal to sell. On the second floor of the wrecked apartments, he made a horrifying discovery. The body of a child lay on the bathroom floor. Alton Coleman, the FBI's prime suspect in the abduction of 9-year-old Vernita Wheat from her home in Kenosha, Wisconsin, remained at large. As the hunt for Coleman intensified, a man scouring for scrap metal in an abandoned building in Waukegan, Illinois, came across the lifeless body of a young girl. The forensic team arrived at the building. Beneath a blanket, wrapped in a man's corduroy jacket, the investigators found the young girl. Her hands, feet, and neck were bound by a television cable. She was too badly decomposed to confirm her identity. But Special Agent Jeff Showers believed they had found the body of Vernita Wheat.
The clothing matched the description that we had from the mother. She was still wearing the barrettes in her hair that matched from what her mother had described her as being last known to be wearing. She was wearing the green nylon jacket. In the pocket of the jacket were carnival tickets, and we knew from an interview of her mother that the night in question, Alton Coleman had taken Vernita Wheat to a carnival.
While the investigators suspected the body was Vernita Wheat, it was up to the forensic team to prove that the remains were hers. They also needed to find evidence that could conclusively point to the killer. Starting from the location of the body, they worked their way out in concentric circles, collecting anything that looked like it could be used as evidence. Investigators swabbed walls and door frames in an effort to find prints. Figuring whoever moved the body into the room had to come in contact with the door, they removed it from its hinges and sent it to the FBI labs in Washington, D.C. Under the lab's microscopes, FBI examiners discerned a thumbprint on the door. Comparison to samples they had on file were conclusive. The thumbprint came from Alton Coleman. Examiners also compared prints taken from the little girl's hands to those lifted from Vernita Wheat's school books that had been retrieved from her home. That comparison was also positive. The search for Vernita was over. Investigators now had enough evidence to issue another warrant for Alton Coleman. This time, it was for the murder of Vernita Wheat.
We knew then that Alton Coleman was responsible for the death of this child. And now we've got not only a kidnapper, but we also have someone who's committed murder.
I know, but
while at the autopsy to determine Vernita Wheat's exact cause of death, a television news broadcast caught the attention of Agent Showers and Detective Hansen.
The first news that a little girl had been found murdered in Gary, Indiana. Agent Showers, I think, immediately thought that there could be some connection to Coleman.
The report also mentioned something that investigators found disturbing. There were 2 killers, and the second suspect was described as being a black female. Investigators immediately suspected Coleman's girlfriend, Deborah Brown, who had not been seen in weeks. If investigators were right, Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown had traveled 90 miles from their hometown neighborhood. They were on the move, and they were leaving bodies along their way. At the hospital in Gary, Indiana, local police officers questioned 9-year-old Mary James about the afternoon of June 16th. Mary told the officers that she and 7-year-old Janice Clay were walking to the store when they were approached by a man and a woman on bikes. The couple introduced themselves. They told the little girls that they had some clothes that the girls might like. To retrieve the clothes, Mary and Janice followed the couple into the woods.
How old are you? Take care of yourself. We're gonna get the man.
Mary was close to death when she managed to drag herself to the street.
I'll show you these photos.
She was able to identify Coleman, but could not identify Brown from photographs sent by the FBI. However, the girl's description matched Brown exactly. Now, investigators were dealing with 2 killers.
We had looked at Deborah Brown up until that point in time as a witness because she had cooperated with us in Waukegan. She had told us about Alton, telling her that he had done something wrong. She showed us the clothes that he had been wearing the night he had come back, when he'd been out all night and when he came back in the morning. So we had looked at her as a witness. We now knew from the investigation in Gary that she was likely assisting him.
Investigators struggled to figure out some way to predict Coleman and Brown's next move. Both murders occurred in largely black communities, communities where the two could easily blend in. And they were quick to gain people's trust.
These were street people. They had that charm. They didn't have to do any arm twisting. It was always a very easy thing with them.
Searching for anything that might help them locate and stop the killers, investigators consulted an FBI behavioral profiler. For the profiler, the escalating pattern of violence was caused by Coleman's legal problems back in Waukegan.
He saw the fact that he had taken Vernita the night before a court appearance on the rape of a 14-year-old, and that he had abducted her and then murdered her as an indication that he was responding to the stress of the court appearance, and so that he would continue to murder out of anger and stress and rage.
Investigators had reason to fear that the 2 murders were only the beginning of a ferocious crime spree. To capture a serial killer, the profiler suggested a massive national media campaign aimed at the black communities.
So we started a publicity campaign, releasing his photograph, releasing pictures of Brown to the media, press releases, everything we could to get his picture out in the forefront. Our hope was that somebody would see him and turn him in.
But the task force was always a step behind. On July 8th, agents received information from local Ohio detectives about an elderly woman named Rose Wiggins who reported her daughter missing. Rose explained that earlier in the day she had come by to check on her daughter and found the door locked. Her young grandson, James, was too frightened to open the door. The detective convinced him they were there to help. Now he had nothing to fear. Officers immediately started to search the house for the boy's missing mother. While looking, they found 3-year-old Johnny, afraid like his older brother. Meanwhile, James told the detective about the man and woman who had been at their house.
Well, they were in this house.
He showed the 8-year-old photos of the suspects, Coleman and Brown.
This is the lady, right?
James positively identified them as the couple who were there the night before.
You were absolutely sure? Okay, Raymond. How you doing? Detective Smith.
Searching the house for the boy's mother, the police found blood smeared throughout the kitchen. It led down to the basement. Not knowing who or what awaited them, the investigators followed the grisly trail. In Ohio, police responding to a missing persons call made an alarming discovery. The young son of the missing mother had identified fugitives Coleman and Brown as having been in their home. Blood stained the walls. They proceeded cautiously, not knowing if their suspects could still be lurking in the darkened basement. The trail stopped, where the bodies of mother and daughter, Virginia and Kimberly Blake, were discovered, shoved into a crawl space beneath their home.
Coleman and Brown, we didn't know where they were, and the violence connected with the murders and the crime scenes was beginning to intensify.
The officers continued their search, still believing their suspects could be somewhere in the family's home. But they seemed to have slipped away, leaving behind unmistakable evidence, clippings of jerry-curled hair. James recounted for investigators that his mother, Virginia, had met Coleman and Brown earlier in the day.
How you guys doing? Fine. Hey, we just moved to the area down the street. What's your name?
The couple stopped by the house and played with the kids.
Yes, we like live down the street. We're just like riding around.
Virginia invited them to stay for dinner. It was just like any other summer evening in the neighborhood. Virginia cooked while the kids hung around and chatted with their new friends.
Are you going to go ahead and rent? Are you going to stay?
8-year-old James saw Coleman take a knife from the counter and slip it into his back pocket.
Soup's on, guys. Soup's on.
After enjoying dinner together, Coleman, Brown, James, and his younger brother settled into the living room to watch television. At the top of the evening news, the story of a pair of killers on the loose flashed across the screen. Coleman immediately turned off the television and shuffled the boys off to bed,
Have a good night.
while Kimberly and Virginia washed the dishes. Aware of the growing media attention, Coleman realized he and Deborah needed to change their look. He found some scissors and cut off his hair. Coleman, with Brown at his side, approached the little girl and her mother. Just upstairs, James and Johnny were asleep.
What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?
They dragged the slain woman and her daughter downstairs and stuffed them into a crawl space.
The pressure was mounting. It was becoming increasingly stressful because here we were for the 4th time catching up with him when we found more bodies.
Coleman and Brown's MO was designed to catch their victims off guard.
When someone comes up to your house on a bicycle, you figure them to be local. If they're walking, you may be a little bit suspicious. But if they're riding a bike, They're from the neighborhood. Your guard is automatically down.
News of the murdered mother and daughter horrified the community. The savage nature of the killings caused the FBI to add an 11th position on their 10 most wanted fugitives list. It was a rare occurrence. The number 11 ranking was reserved for particularly vicious killers, a description fitting Coleman and Brown.
The magnitude and the importance of it, that, you know, you've already got 10 that are bad, but here's one that's so bad, but we don't have room to put anybody else on. We're going to make an exception and put him on anyway, even though he's number 11.
With the national media spotlight focusing on the couple, it would be difficult for them to remain anonymous.
And in solving fugitive cases, finding people, there is nothing better than publicity, because all you need is the one phone call from one person saying, I saw this picture and I know it's this individual.
Phone calls poured in with more frequency and speed than ever before. Any crime that matched their suspect's MO was funneled back to the task force headquarters. Hopefully, they would be able to get one step ahead of the fugitives. Investigators were sure that Coleman and Brown would tire of a life on the run and return to familiar territory. Agents contacted everyone the two associated with in Waukegan.
We would contact them and let them know that we're still looking for them. We would go out and tell them that Alton and Deborah had been involved in another murder case, hoping that that would get them a little bit more on our side.
On July 13th, local investigators responded to a frantic 911 call from a suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio. Michelle Stone told the officers what had happened that day.
They were both young.
A couple arrived at the Stones' house earlier that morning. They told Michelle's father, Jack Stone, that they were interested in buying his camper, which was for sale in the driveway. Jack's wife, Anna, joined them on the porch. As Jack and Anna chatted with them, Michelle left for work.
I won't be long. I'll see you guys later. You'll be home for dinner? Yeah, I will. All right.
Be careful, Mom.
Bye-bye.
I remember I didn't really see them.
When she arrived home later that day, Michelle noticed the bikes the couple had arrived on were still in the yard. And her father's car was missing.
Mom?
Inside, she found her parents' home had been vandalized.
Mom?
She had called out to her mother and father. Hearing no response, her mind began to race as she stepped through the shattered glass and overturned furniture littering the room.
Dad? Mom? Dad?
As she called 911, Michelle could hear a weak voice calling out from another room. Next to the basement door, she noticed a bloody palm print.
Dad? Dad, are you here?
She walked down into the dimly lit room, not knowing what or who she might find. Lying next to each other, motionless on the floor, she discovered her parents. Her father, Jack, was barely alive. As she reached to take her mother's pulse, she lifted the sheet. Her mother, Anna, was dead. Michelle waited by her father's side for help to arrive.
My mom had a sheet over her body.
Her parents had been bludgeoned and bound. Michelle's description of the couple that had stopped by her parents' house earlier that day matched the fugitives, Coleman and Brown. A forensic team went to work collecting evidence. Among the items was a pair of plastic shoes next to Anna Stone. A recent sighting of the suspects included a description of Brown wearing these same shoes. Crime scene technicians also retrieved other bloodied tools found around the body. Later, forensics confirmed the crowbar was used to kill Mrs. Stone. Coleman's prints were all over it. He made no attempt to conceal his crimes. But there was nothing to suggest where the couple had gone.
It was all dead ends. Every time we'd find a body, they were gone. You don't have anything as to which way they're going. You have no indicators as to who their next victim's going to be. Depends. If they wanted sexual gratification, they may snatch a child. If they need a vehicle, they may snatch an adult. Just don't know. We've got a couple of mad dogs out there.
The crime against the Stones showed the couple was able to gain the trust of people from outside the black urban centers where they had found their first 4 victims. This realization only complicated the investigation. Coleman could fit in anywhere.
Or they would come up on a bicycle and start chatting, and he would be looking to play in a card game. Or sometimes they would respond, they wanted to buy something, or they had something for sale. He was an extremely glib person, a real con man. And people trusted him. Plus, he was traveling with a woman. And so people were not nearly as suspect of him as they should have been.
Though Coleman's rage continued to intensify, his ability to charm more victims remained consistent. And he was showing no signs of growing tired of the kill. A month and a half had passed since Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown embarked on a killing spree that had left 5 victims dead. In Cincinnati, Coleman bludgeoned a husband and wife, leaving the wife dead and the husband barely clinging to life. Their car was missing. An APB was immediately put out on the vehicle. Two days later, a farm worker discovered the abandoned car on his property in Lexington, Kentucky, 105 miles away from the crime in Cincinnati. In less than 2 days, the fugitives had traveled hundreds of miles across 2 states. The FBI media blitz was leaving them with few places to hide. But the couple appeared to be heading further away from their home in Illinois, not closer, as investigators had hoped.
When you're talking about Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown, they are not a normal killing machine. A normal killing machine is going to be one person. We've now got 2 out there. They're working together. They're feeding off each other, and one's giving support. Those are the problems. We couldn't separate them. We couldn't talk to one. We couldn't talk to either one of them.
Knowing Coleman would eventually need to steal a car, the FBI saturated the Lexington, Kentucky area. They did not have to wait long for signs that he was still in town. In a hotel parking lot, Professor Oline Carmichael was assaulted and his car stolen. A couple forced him to hand over his cash and car keys. Leaving the professor wounded but still alive, they sped away. After receiving medical attention, police asked Carmichael to look at mugshots that included the FBI's most wanted fugitives. Without hesitating, he pointed to Coleman and Brown.
That's her, without a doubt. Those are the two.
The FBI were now only a few hours behind the fugitives. An APB was issued for Carmichael's car. In a matter of hours, they received a response. It came from police in an Ohio town close to the Kentucky border. The professor's car was found, abandoned behind some vacant buildings. Coleman and Brown, however, were nowhere in sight. For the experienced agents, finding the car in Ohio meant Coleman and Brown were probably on their way home.
Gut instinct is going to tell you that he's going to come back home. He may not come back to Waukegan, but he's going to come back to some place that he feels comfortable with. He'd never been to Gary, Indiana. He'd never been to Detroit. He had never been to Toledo. Had never been to Cincinnati, Dayton, Ohio, Lexington, Kentucky. At some point, he's going to get tired and he's going to want to get back to comfort. Some place that he feels comfortable. He knows the streets. He knows the people. He's going to feel comfortable. He's coming back.
The FBI immediately set up a dragnet. Agents and police officers from across several states joined forces to track Coleman and Brown as they headed home to Illinois. Reports of stolen vehicles or assaults were to be given immediate attention. An officer in Dayton, Ohio, responded to a report involving an assault and a stolen car. The call came from an elderly couple, Reverend and Mrs. Gay. Reverend Gay had been badly beaten. Mrs. Gay told the officer that a young couple who they had met weeks earlier broke into their house. After beating them, the attackers demanded the keys to their station wagon. According to the description, the attackers were Coleman and Brown. New leads were coming in at a furious pace. Coleman and Brown were still just out of reach. But the FBI was starting to close the gap. The day after the attack in Ohio, detectives involved in the FBI's dragnet discovered a station wagon that had been abandoned near a car wash in Indiana. It belonged to Reverend Gay. Later in the day, some road crew workers on the edge of Interstate 65 outside of Zionsville, Indiana, made a gruesome discovery. It was the body of an elderly man who had been reported missing from his home in Indiana. He was found on his 77th birthday. Evidence left at the scene was unmistakable. Coleman and Brown had claimed another life. The body was found less than 20 miles from the couple's home turf. The country's most wanted fugitives had come home, and the FBI was waiting for them. For 7 weeks, Coleman and Brown assaulted and killed victims in 6 different states. While investigators worked the crime scenes, scores of local officers and agents organized a dragnet to trap them as they headed back home to Illinois. The aggressive media campaign was having an impact. On July 20th, in Evanston, Illinois, a man spotted Alton Coleman with Deborah Brown in Mason Park. While he waited with the car running, his friend called the police. It was the one phone call investigators had been hoping for.
He went to school with Alton Coleman. He knew without a shadow of a doubt that the man that crossed the street in front of him was Alton Coleman.
Evanston police responded. Only a couple of yards stood between the law and Coleman and Brown. With surprising ease, they were able to corner Coleman. He insisted they had the wrong man. A second pair of officers surrounded Brown. When asked, she gave a different pair of names for herself and Coleman.
What's your name?
Trina Williams.
Having found a knife and a false identification, the officers brought Alton Coleman to the police station.
4 other units be advised when you pick up the female, she might have a weapon in her purse. Make sure you check it. She's 10-0.
A search of Brown's handbag uncovered a .38 caliber pistol.
523-607. Meet us over here. We got
The weapon was all they needed to handcuff her and take her in.
Anything we need to know about? No?
2 of the FBI's most wanted were apprehended without incident. After nearly 2 months, the violent rampage was over. Coleman continued to insist he hadn't been in any of the places where the murders happened. But the forensic evidence collected over the past 7 weeks proved otherwise. Alton Coleman was charged with the federal crime of kidnapping Vernita Wheat, followed by murder charges in 3 other states. Deborah Brown was also charged for her role in the murders. As investigators from the task force looked on, a strip search uncovered a bloody steak knife. It would be linked to yet another murder, a 15-year-old Ohio girl, Alice Myers. Illinois State's Attorney Matthew Chansey was given the task of prosecuting Alton Coleman. In his mind, the motive was simple.
With Vernita Wheat, he crossed a threshold, and once he crossed that threshold, it was easy for him, and I think that he enjoyed it. And it wasn't just easy anymore; it was something he liked. He liked doing, and so he looked for every opportunity he could to repeat that.
Together, Coleman and Brown had stolen 7 lives. 3 states sought to take theirs. Brown stood trial separately. She was sentenced to life in prison. Until the end, she was committed to Coleman.
At Coleman's sentencing hearing for that murder, she testified on his behalf that she had committed the murder and he had not, in an obvious attempt to try to save him. It didn't work.
Coleman and Brown's rampage had covered over 1,300 miles in 6 states. For Special Agent Berdina Passanelli, the intensity of the FBI's hunt prevented more needless murders.
Because of the massive investigation that we did and the publicity that we did, that he was caught within 7 weeks of when he started. Had we not done that, had we not gotten on this right away, who knows how long he would have gone on killing people.
In the end, Alton Coleman was sentenced to death 4 times. He went to prison in Ohio, where he was executed on April 26, 2002.
10 days before the holidays, in a small Pennsylvania town, a new mother is excited by her baby's first Christmas. But when they disappear without a trace, the holiday turns tragic. Investigators suspect her husband is somehow responsible. But with little evidence, they called on the FBI to find the answers before time ran out for the missing mother and child.
A woman and her infant son vanish. The husband is frantic. The clues are scarce, but hopes linger, even as the hours and days tick by without a word. Was she on the run or the victim of foul play? I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. It was an investigation filled with blind alleys and dead ends. In order to go forward, we had to revisit the past.
Catasauqua, Pennsylvania, 1 hour north of Philadelphia. A quiet, blue-collar town, a safe place to raise a family. By December 15th, 1994, the town was preparing for the holiday season. The house at 740 Front Street was already decorated. Inside, 26-year-old Joanne Katrinak, happily married and a new mother, was especially excited about the holidays. It would be the first Christmas for her 4-month-old son, Alex. Joanne and her mother-in-law, Veronica, planned to spend the day at a nearby mall.
Hey. Yeah.
Now Joanne called to say that Alex was dressed and ready. They'd be right over. Joanne wanted to find the perfect gift for her husband, Andy. They'd been married less than 2 years. And though they didn't have a lot of money, Joanne had been saving for the holiday. Before Joanne had met Andy, she had had some bad relationships. Her first husband was abusive. The marriage had ended in divorce. But she was happy now. Her husband, Andy Katrinak, came home a little after 6 o'clock that evening. He was self-employed as a contractor and sometimes worked long hours. Before he'd met Joanne, Andy had been a confirmed bachelor. But it seemed that finding this kind and beautiful woman had changed his life. Usually, Joanne and Alex were waiting for him when he came home. But not tonight. That didn't seem to worry Andy. After all, it was Christmas time and the mall traffic would be heavy. He saw that Joanne had left some chicken to defrost. He settled in to relax and wait for his family. An hour went by, then another. Still, Andy didn't seem concerned. He watched TV and drank another beer. At 8 p.m., Andy finally decided to check on his wife. His first call was to his mother, Veronica.
Hi, Mom. You seen Joanne?
He knew Joanne had planned to shop with her.
Well, it's,
But now his mother said Joanne had never come by.
No, well, did you didn't
Nor had she answered her phone calls.
Well, no, she didn't. That's why I'm calling you, because I hadn't seen her. I hadn't heard from her yet. No. Well, what'd you guys do?
Veronica was worried. She said she and her husband, Andrew Sr., would be right over. While he waited for his parents, Andy checked the house to see if anything was amiss. In the basement, he found the door leading outside, open. A door he and Joanne never used. The lock had been pried away from the door frame. Andy immediately called the police. 2 officers from the Catasauqua Police Department responded. By then, Andy's parents had arrived. Andy told police the events of the day. The shopping trip that never happened. The apparent disappearance of Joanne and little Alex.
Taken this year.
He claimed they had been abducted, and officers agreed that was a possibility. But it was also plausible that Joanne had left on her own and taken her child with her.
Well, yeah.
Or maybe Andy had somehow been involved.
She didn't hear from her. She was supposed to meet with her.
Veronica described her phone call with Joanne and the subsequent calls that went unanswered.
I had my coat on and waited, and she never showed up.
Here, you guys see this?
Andy now showed police the padlock that had been broken off the basement door.
Yeah.
But the officers were not convinced it was related to the missing mother and child. That night, Andy stayed home by the phone while his father searched the surrounding area for Joanne and Alex. At 3 in the morning, Andrew Sr. had found something and brought his son to see it.
What is this?
Joanne's tan Toyota was backed into a spot in the parking lot of McCarty's Tavern,
What is this?
down the street from the Katrinak's home.
That's her keys, Andy.
Inside were Joanne's keys and her small canister of mace. Again, Andy called Catasauqua police. This time, police suspected foul play. But the local force lacked the resources and experience needed to lead the investigation. So they contacted Pennsylvania state troopers for assistance. With the possibility of an abduction, Major Robert Wirtz looked to the most likely suspect, Joanne's husband, Andy Katrinak.
There was a lot of looking into the family life and looking at what Andrew did on that particular day and those sorts of things. One of the things that you're always forced to do in these types of investigations is look at family members.
State police arrived at Andy's house the next morning.
You see that right there?
Andy told them that overnight he had noticed something else. A cut phone line in the
You
basement.
get crime scene down here?
One of 2 separate phone lines in the house.
And I left it for you.
The one cut serviced the cordless phone, while the other serviced the kitchen phone. It appeared to investigators that whoever cut the line knew where to look and which one to cut. State police evidence technicians also found a partial boot print on the basement floor and tool marks on the door frame where the padlock was pried off.
Laundry upstairs. No, she didn't come down.
As crime scene technicians checked the house, they found nothing to remove suspicion from Andy. In the master bedroom, there was no indication Joanne had packed for a long trip. Andy confirmed that his wife's clothes all seemed to be in the closet, and the couple's suitcases were under the bed where he said they always kept them. Technicians found no blood or other signs of foul play. They dusted for fingerprints around the room's entry points, but found only Andy's and Joanne's. In the baby's room, there were also no signs that little Alex had been taken on a long trip, and no indication of a struggle or robbery. At the state police barracks garage, evidence technicians processed Joanne's car. They hoped something left behind could lead them closer to the missing mother and child. On the headrest of the driver's seat, they found 6 dirty blonde hairs. One was partially smeared with a dark red substance, maybe blood. But nothing immediately pointed to Joanne and Alex's whereabouts. As lead investigator, Trooper Bob Egan was suspicious of the way the car had been found.
There were a couple things that led Andy Katrinak to believe that his wife did not
back that car. And number one is that she never used that parking lot to park her vehicle. They had a parking lot in back of their house. And number two, she never backed the car in. When she parked into a parking space, she always pulled in front of the vehicle first. She was very bad at backing up.
3 days had passed since Andy's wife and son disappeared. His parents posted flyers throughout his neighborhood and in Catasauqua's shopping district.
Tell me, have you seen this woman or the baby?
Anywhere Joanne and Alex might have
I
visited.
have not.
This is a picture of our daughter-in-law. This is our grandchild.
With still no word from Joanne or a kidnapper, troopers delved further into Andy's background. They found him anxious when he spoke of his former days as a semi-pro boxer in Las Vegas. He was good with his fists and earned his living as an instructor when he first moved to Pennsylvania. Now a private contractor, Andy barely made enough to pay the bills. A wife, a house, and a baby strained the new father's resources. Troopers asked to see his financial records, including insurance documents, bank statements, and phone records.
I got some checks.
He told them that his wife had only minimal life insurance.
I know you probably would have wanted phone records, so I brought that down too.
On the day she disappeared with his son, Andy said he had been with his father, building a room addition for a client who lived a few miles from his home. Troopers were not satisfied. They suspected he may have still been hiding something. They demanded that Andy take a polygraph test.
Right now, do you know where your wife is located?
No, I don't.
The first test showed that Andy had not been deceptive regarding his family's disappearance. But investigators needed to be sure. So they tested him again.
No, I didn't.
The results were conclusive.
No.
Andy was telling the truth about his missing wife and baby. Investigators cleared the husband as a suspect.
No, I'm not.
By now, Joanne and Alex had been missing for 4 days, and investigators still had no solid leads. Whether it had been a desertion or an abduction, it was possible the woman and child had crossed state lines. On December 19, 1994, state police called on the FBI for help. Special Agent Dave Rowe from the FBI's Allentown office joined the effort.
We began our investigation by identifying, locating, and interviewing virtually all of the relatives, virtually all of the friends, former work colleagues, anybody and everybody who was either related to or acquainted with Andy, Joanne, and Alex.
Open. Coffee? Yes, thank you.
Local, state, and federal agencies funneled their resources into the search for the missing woman and child. 6 days before Christmas, it seemed as if they had vanished without a trace. Joanne Katranek, a 26-year-old mother, and her 4-month-old son, Alex, had mysteriously disappeared from their Catasauqua, Pennsylvania home. Her husband, Andy, had been cleared of suspicion. Now investigators traveled across Pennsylvania state lines to question Joanne's ex-husband, who lived and worked in New Jersey. Mike Jack had married Joanne in 1991. They were divorced just a few months later, amidst allegations that Jack was abusive. Maybe Joanne had decided to rekindle the relationship. Or perhaps her ex had come to win her back. But investigators found Jack had a solid alibi for the date of Joanne's disappearance. Agents also pursued people from Andy's past,
What are you doing here? Well,
including his ex-girlfriend, Pat Rohrer.
December 14th. Anything wrong?
An FBI agent interviewed Rohrer at her home in North Carolina.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I keep all
He
kinds
found
of
she too had a solid alibi for the day Joanne and Alex had vanished.
I'll tell you what, I really appreciate that, man.
Okay.
Back in Catasauqua, investigators returned to McCarty's Tavern, where Joanne's car had been found the day she had disappeared. Maybe someone had noticed her, or whoever had parked the car. Troopers and agents eventually interviewed everyone who had been at the bar that night, but no one had seen a thing.
Were you working last Thursday night?
Yes, I was.
Investigators also canvassed the Katrinac neighborhood. One neighbor directed them to a handyman who rented a room down the street. He'd done repair work in several local homes. Detectives soon discovered he had a criminal record for breaking and entering. He seemed a promising suspect. He admitted to police he had had some run-ins with the law, but swore he had no knowledge of Joanne and Alex's disappearance. He agreed to come in for further questioning. Investigators learned the handyman lived in a lean-to by a river near the Katrinac's house during the summer months. The state police canine team searched the shelter for any evidence that Joanne and Alex had been there. They found nothing, and the handyman was cleared. Another dead end. For frustrated investigators, precious time slipped away as community concern grew.
Man.
State Police Major Robert Wirtz helped establish hotlines to elicit the public's help.
There was obviously a lot of concerns in the community as to what occurred. So we had a command post set up here at the barracks with a number of telephone lines coming into the command post. Those phone numbers were given to the public, and we in fact did get information from the public.
Reports of sightings poured in. One resident reported seeing Joanne with an unidentified man near railroad tracks behind the Katrinac's home. She was carrying a baby and seemed frightened by the man pulling her further into the brush against her will. In response, FBI agents and state police immediately conducted a massive line search of a 4-mile stretch near the railroad tracks. The search continued through the night. They scanned the area inch by inch as choppers circled overhead. But again, investigators found nothing. Trooper Joe Kosovar, now co-lead investigator with his partner Bob Egan, recalls that reports of sightings continued.
They saw her along the railroad tracks. They saw her on an airplane. They saw her in a convenience store with the baby, but none of them checked out. They were false leads, and apparently people who they saw and thought they saw were two different people.
Christmas passed and spring began, with still no word of Joanne and Alex. Then on April 9th, a farmer was tilling his field in Heidelberg Township, 15 miles northwest of Catasauqua. He saw what looked like a pile of clothes at the field's edge. When he walked over to investigate, he encountered a horrifying sight. Human remains. Four months after the disappearance of Joanne Katrinac and her infant son, Alex, a farmer found the decaying bodies of a mother and child at the edge of his Pennsylvania field. The FBI and troopers arrived immediately. Dental records would later confirm what they already suspected. The bodies were Alex and Joanne Katrinac's. Joanne lay on her back, a diaper bag still on her shoulder.
I don't see any visible wounds.
She had been shot once in the head and beaten about the face. Alex was face down on his mother's stomach, dressed in the blue snowsuit he'd worn on his ill-fated trip to meet his grandmother. The bodies were 50 feet past the end of a trail that ran through the woods. Nearby, crime scene technicians found a baby bottle and a rattle. To Trooper Bob Egan, the location of the items was significant.
You could see items that had fallen to the ground almost in a sequence as if an assault started and Joanne was walking or running away from the assault, and she was dropping items along the way.
It appeared the killer had driven up to the end of the trail, and from there had forced Joanne to walk the remaining 50 feet. Evidence technicians would spend 15 hours searching the area, but they found no shell casings, fingerprints, footprints, or murder weapons. In the hopes that the forest debris might yield answers, they collected leaves and dirt from beneath the bodies and sent them to the police lab for closer examination. For Major Robert Wirtz and the others who'd worked the case for months, the finality of this brutal murder evoked a barrage of emotions.
When the bodies were found, there was a period of time there when it was very difficult for the officers that were assigned to this investigation. Took it very personally, and it was hard because I think they were holding out hope that, you know, she was going to be found alive.
With the mysterious disappearance officially deemed a homicide, the case remained under state jurisdiction. But the FBI never stopped actively assisting.
Hello, Linda. Dave Rowe here. The fact that somebody would abduct a new mother and a 4-month-old infant, everybody can identify with that. And once you become aware of that, you want to be part of the investigation.
An autopsy revealed that Joanne had been shot once with a .22 caliber bullet and beaten 19 times with a blunt object. The fact that there had been 2 modes of attack was a telling clue for Trooper Joe Kosovar.
Based on the absence of empty shell casings and the fact that the victim had received 1 shot and numerous blows to the head, led me to believe that the gun malfunctioned.
The medical examiner was unable to determine exactly how baby Alex was killed, whether he'd been suffocated or left to die of exposure. Police continued to analyze the physical evidence found at the crime scene. To help build the case, they brought in prosecutor Mike McIntyre of the Lehigh County District Attorney's Office.
We found 2 more hairs that first matched the 6 hairs found on that headrest in color and length.
But the hairs would have to be examined forensically to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they matched. A Pennsylvania State Police forensic scientist conducted the lab analysis. The results confirmed what investigators had suspected. The hairs belonged to the same person. And the substance on one of them was determined to be human blood, containing DNA consistent with Joanne's. But to whom did the hairs belong? Tests quickly ruled out the Katrinaks and several of Joanne's friends who had access to the car. Pennsylvania State Police were baffled.
How far are we on this?
Again, they turned to the FBI for help. The FBI sent a behavioral profiler from Washington, D.C. A profiler can help narrow the search for suspects by detailing the type of person responsible for a crime through that person's behavioral characteristics. Profilers study a variety of crime-related information, including case reports, geography, timing, and the victim's habits. Then they revisit the crime scenes to read the locations for clues to the killer's behavior. Investigators first took the profiler to the place the bodies were found. He would look for anything that might reveal the killer's signature. The area was so far from the abduction site, the profiler was convinced the killer had been here before. The profiler also hypothesized the killer had been male because the attack had been so brutal. The abduction had taken place in broad daylight, which offered another hint. The killer would be someone comfortable being seen in the small town of Catasauqua, and someone who perhaps knew the family's habits and the layout of the house. By fleshing out this portrait of the killer, the profiler gave investigators new direction in a frustrating case. But troopers needed a name that fit the profile. To find that name, troopers drove Andy around Heidelberg Township, close to where the bodies were found. They hoped to prompt his memory of someone who knew this rural area. They asked if Joanne had ever visited here. Was there a friend or a family member who lived nearby? Andy could think of no one. Disappointed, investigators returned to State Police headquarters. Then, just as Andy was about to leave, he remembered something. He did know someone who knew Heidelberg Township, and also his home in Catasauqua. His ex-girlfriend, Pat Rohrer, had once managed a stable in Heidelberg.
And with that, he tells me that he couldn't tell me the exact place, what it was called, because he couldn't remember the name, but he could give me directions on how to get there. So I told him, I said, well, tell me. As he started to tell me the directions of how to get to where Patty Rohrer was boarding a horse and taking care of horses, well, I knew he was taking me right to the area where Joanne and the baby were found.
We used to go together.
Pat Rohrer and Andy had lived together briefly in Pennsylvania. He told investigators he once visited her at the stable. But they'd broken up in 1989, and she had moved back to North Carolina.
How you been? Yeah? It's all right.
Then in the spring of 1991, before Andy met Joanne, Rohrer had visited him unexpectedly after a fight with her most recent boyfriend. Andy was sympathetic. He let Rohrer stay for a few days, though their relationship remained purely a friendship. Then she returned to North Carolina.
Fresno Road.
Not long after that, Andy met Joanne.
We lived together for a while.
As he now told state troopers, it was love at first sight. They were married soon after, in the spring of 1993. They agreed they wanted children, and less than a year later, Joanne was pregnant.
Hey, sweetie.
Hey, baby.
Alex was born in August of 1994.
That you think is so adorable? Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know what, I think it's...
Now Andy told investigators about something that had happened 3 days before his wife and son disappeared.
I will. Hello?
On December 12th, Joanne answered a phone call.
May I tell him who's calling?
It was Pat Rohrer.
It's her. Pat?
What does she want?
What do you think she wants?
Joanne told Rohrer that Andy was married now and that they had a baby. She told Rohrer not to call again.
Please, don't
then
call us.
Joanne hung up on her.
I used to date a girl.
Though Andy knew Pat had a temper, he dismissed the idea that she might seek revenge. Then the investigation took an unexpected turn. The second mother and child were found brutally murdered. The pair, who resembled Joanne and Alex, were discovered in a retail store dressing room in nearby Collegeville, Pennsylvania. Investigators now wondered if a serial killer was on the loose, preying on mothers and children in Pennsylvania. While investigating the homicide of Joanne and Alex Katrinak, Pennsylvania State Police responded to another double murder in a retail store just 45 miles away. The victims were a second young mother and her baby. Police feared a serial killer was on the prowl. They quickly arrested the suspect, the store owner's son. While he confessed to this killing, he had an airtight alibi for the day Joanne and Alex were slain. Now police turned their attention to Andy Katrinak's ex-girlfriend, Pat Rohrer.
Yeah, we got a couple of things going down.
Rohrer was a long shot, a brunette instead of a blonde, and a woman, though the profiler believed the murderer was male. But she was familiar with both the abduction and murder sites. Then Trooper Joe Kosovar recalled that he'd worked on a case that was strangely similar. He phoned Special Agent Dave Rowe.
Trooper Joe Kosovar recollected that he had investigated a homicide some years earlier where the cause of death was blunt force blows to the head. The assailant was determined to be a woman, while 1, 2, 3, 4 blows by an adult male would produce the same damage that a woman might have to strike 15, 20, 25 blows to accomplish.
Joanne Katrinak had sustained 19 blows. But could a woman have killed her and her infant as well? In May of 1995, 6 months after the murders, troopers Bob Egan and Joe Kosovar traveled to North Carolina. The FBI had helped coordinate a meeting with the Lexington County Sheriff's Office. Together, authorities from the 2 states would interview Pat Rohrer at her attorney's office. Rohrer's mother was also there.
You exercise the horses. Can you tell us more?
Rohrer expanded upon her original alibis. On December 15th, the day of the crime, she said she'd visited a local tanning salon. That evening, she'd taken her regular Thursday night dance lesson at the Cowboys Nightlife bar.
Why'd you guys split up?
Rohrer admitted she'd worked at the stable in Heidelberg Township, but said she hadn't been back to Pennsylvania since she'd visited Andy after the fight with her boyfriend. She also swore she'd never owned a gun. Lieutenant Tony Roberson of the Lexington County Sheriff's Department helped agents and troopers investigate her statements.
The first thing that they wanted to do was discredit her alibis to find out whether they could be corroborated or whether they could be found to be invalid.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Investigators visited the tanning salon Rohrer claimed to have used on the day of the murders. Prosecutor Mike McIntyre remembers this alibi quickly proved false.
The owner of the tanning salon, Mrs. Simerson, said, "Hey, you know what? Something's wrong here, because we were closed on that particular day that Pat Rohrer says she was in getting a tan, because that's my husband's birthday, and we were over at the shopping mart in some city about 50 miles away, and I remember that, and I have a receipt for you from the shopping mall to show that we were there."
Excuse me, sir.
At the Cowboys Nightlife bar, the dance instructor knew Rohrer as a regular.
We're investigating a murder up in Pennsylvania, and we understand that
The club's sign-in sheet showed she'd been there the Thursday before December 15th and the Thursday after, but not on the 15th.
And she was there.
Investigators secured Rohrer's phone records. They showed she'd used the phone every day of December 1994, except from the 12th through the 15th. Despite her alibis, Rohrer could not prove she'd been in North Carolina on the day of the killings. More incriminating still, her police record revealed a history of violence.
She has violent tendencies, has had them in the past. She was charged in a neighboring county in Forsyth County of getting into a fight over a man at a bar. And she was arrested that night.
But investigators were still missing one key piece of evidence: the murder weapon. Rora continued to deny she'd ever owned a gun. But investigators kept digging. At a North Carolina stable, they found one of her ex-boyfriends, Walter Blaylock. He distinctly remembered that Rora had bought a handgun for $50 at a yard sale. It was a .22 caliber Jennings, which they had used for target shooting in Rora's backyard.
You put your hands on me, girl!
The last time he had seen it was during an intense argument.
Calm down, Pat! I'm not gonna calm down! Calm down! Don't do something foolish! Please! Settle down! Put the gun down!
Now Blaylock told Trooper Egan the gun had a curious flaw.
He went on to describe the handgun as being a junky piece of junk type of handgun that often after the first time you shot it, it jammed, not allowing you to fire a second shot. Now this fed into the theory why somebody would be shot once and then beaten about the head.
The FBI helped coordinate interstate efforts to secure a probable cause warrant to search Rora's North Carolina home for the murder weapon. They arrived with the warrant on July 24th, 1995.
Everyone search your house, man. What are you doing here? Have a warrant.
Despite a thorough search, they didn't find the gun. But they did find numerous spent .22 caliber shell casings in the backyard.
State Police. Detective Egan, Detective Kosovar, ma'am.
Only when police told Rora that they knew she owned a handgun did she admit to it.
Gun in my house.
But she insisted Blaylock had taken it with him when he'd moved out about a month before the murders.
No, I have not.
Why did you buy the gun?
I told you.
The case against Rora was
with
growing,
him,
but it was built on circumstantial evidence.
It's just because he wanted this gun.
Did you get it? She could have dumped it.
And strangely, the only physical evidence, the hairs from the car on the murder site, didn't seem to fit. The hairs were dirty blonde. Rora's hair was brown. Trooper Joe Kosovar wondered if it could have been dyed at the time of the killings. He learned that shortly before the murders, Rora had ridden in a rodeo competition and won. Kosovar contacted the event organizers, hoping they'd taken a photo of her. His inquiry paid off. They sent him the photo. As he'd guessed, Rora's hair was dirty blonde.
The photograph was given to our crime lab personnel, and they compared the color of the photograph of the hair with the color of the hairs that were found in the vehicle and decided that they should further investigate those hairs.
Detectives obtained a warrant to collect blood and hair samples from Pat Rora. If evidence analysts could match her hair to those from Joanne's car on the murder site, the troopers could make their arrest. But they would need to rely on a test so new that it would take more than a year for the test to be approved. Until then, the prime suspect of the double murder would remain free. After an investigation that had lasted almost a year, detectives had a strong suspect in the double murder of Joanne Katranak and her infant son Alex. With a search warrant, they obtained blood and hair samples from Pat Rora, the former girlfriend of Joanne's husband, Andy. Rora was now pregnant with the child of her current boyfriend. Forensic scientists would attempt to match her hair samples with hair found at the crime scenes. The Pennsylvania State Police Lab determined Rora's hairs were microscopically consistent with the recovered hairs. But investigators needed more proof, a match at the cellular level. They extracted Rora's DNA sequence from her blood samples and attempted to compare it with the DNA and hairs from the crime scenes. But there was a problem making a match. Joseph DeZino, Unit Chief at the DNA Analysis Unit 2 at the FBI lab, explains.
When hairs are found at a crime scene, they're normally naturally shed hairs that don't have much tissue upon the root. And if they don't have much tissue upon the root, there's very, very little DNA contained in those hairs. And therefore, our experience has shown us that nuclear DNA analysis will fail.
In this case, only one of the hairs found at the crime scene contained enough skin tissue necessary for nuclear DNA analysis. But there was a great risk. To conduct the test, examiners would have to destroy that sample. If the test was inconclusive, there was no way to repeat the process. They needed a way to test the other hairs that held no skin tissue. A possible solution lay in a new process being pioneered by the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. Mitochondrial DNA testing.
This was brand new. To my knowledge, this was the first forensics laboratory in the United States to bring this new analysis online.
Because the test was so new, it would take more than a year to be certain the results could be scientifically reliable. Mitochondrial DNA testing uses the DNA contained in the cell's mitochondria, or organelles. Since there is more mitochondrial DNA than nuclear DNA in hair cells, it is easier for examiners to retrieve the mitochondrial DNA. With 5 hair samples to test, examiners could repeat the test and obtain more reliable results.
With mitochondrial DNA analysis, we're over 90% successful obtaining DNA from hairs that are naturally shed, hairs without root. And we only need about 1 inch of hair in order to obtain a result, generally speaking.
To attempt a mitochondrial DNA match, first the DNA sequence in a hair cell's mitochondria is isolated. Then its sequence is plotted and compared to the suspect's known DNA sequence, in this case taken from Pat Rohrer's blood cells. Both DNA sequences matched. Forensic scientist Joseph DeZino explains what that meant.
If a hair from a crime scene is found to have the same mitochondrial DNA type as a blood sample from a suspect, our reports state that that suspect cannot be excluded as a source of that hair from the crime scene. Therefore, Patricia Rohrer could not be excluded as a source of these hairs.
However, without nuclear DNA confirmation, the result was not absolutely conclusive. Now scientists examined the hair sample with skin for a nuclear DNA match. It corroborated the mitochondrial match. There was no question that Patricia Rohrer had left those hairs behind. It was a pivotal moment in the case. In the early morning of June 24th, 1997, investigators arrived at Rohrer's home with an arrest warrant.
Pat Rohrer, I've got a warrant for your arrest. I need you to come with us, ma'am, please.
Yes?
Deputy, go with him.
The female detective followed Rohrer upstairs to keep an eye on her as she dressed herself and her 18-month-old daughter. It seemed a routine safety precaution, but it yielded some of the most damaging evidence in the case.
During the time that Pat was trying to settle her baby down and get dressed, the female detective, Suzanne Pearson, was present in the bedroom. And it was at this time that she overheard a conversation that Pat Rohrer had with her baby. Pat's baby's name is Nicole, and what the detective overheard was Pat Rohrer saying to Nicole, Nicole, if I would have known I was going to get caught, I would have never brought you into this world. It was something that Suzanne Pearson, the detective, documented as soon as possible, and this was very damaging.
More than 3 years after the murder of Joanne Katranak and her baby, Pat Rohrer was finally under arrest. She was flown to Pennsylvania to face murder charges. Preparing for trial, prosecutors pieced together the terrifying events of Joanne and Alex Katrinak's last day. On December 15, 1994, Pat Rohrer had broken into the basement of the Katrinak's home, knowing Andy was out and Joanne was alone with Alex. Joanne had no idea Rohrer was downstairs as she called her mother-in-law and packed up baby Alex for a shopping trip.
Right.
From the basement, Rohrer heard every word Joanne said.
All right, I'll see you in a bit. Bye.
And she remembered the house from a visit with Andy 3 years earlier. She knew where to look for the 2 phone lines and which one to cut so Joanne couldn't call for help. Joanne carried Alex outside, still unaware that Pat was in the house. Rohrer heard Joanne leave and went outside to catch up with her. Joanne didn't see Rohrer sneak up behind her, carrying a .22 caliber Jennings.
Oh, get in the car. Oh my God. Get in the car.
Rohrer jumped into the back seat with the baby and forced Joanne to drive. Joanne must have been terrified as she drove with Rohrer's gun at her head, afraid for herself, and more so for her helpless 4-month-old baby. Rohrer directed Joanne to an obscure horse trail in Heidelberg Township. As Rohrer forced her further into the woods, Joanne in her terror dropped Alex's rattle and then his bottle. Rohrer fired once, but then her gun jammed, and she began bludgeoning Joanne. She may have suffocated baby Alex, or simply left him to die slowly of exposure to the December elements. Then Rohrer parked the car at McCarty's Tavern and fled from Pennsylvania. Prosecutors built an airtight case, using evidence investigators had meticulously collected. It was a concerted effort by many in law enforcement, unwilling to let this woman and child perish in silence.
As investigators, we have a responsibility, and that responsibility is to be the voice of the victim, is to gather the information and speak for the victims that can no longer speak.
Close 6.
The jury found Pat Rohrer guilty of 2 counts of kidnapping and 2 of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Legally, the case was closed, and for the town of Catasauqua, the mystery was solved. If not for the advanced forensic technology of the FBI, this brutal double murderer might still be free.